Bonsoir à toutes et à tous. Je pense que la salle va se remplir au fur et à mesure que nous allons avancer dans la soirée, notamment avec les étudiants qui nous ont promis de venir. Donc, merci de nous avoir rejoints ce soir pour cette toute première réunion en format hybride qui s'adresse donc non seulement aux alumni, mais également aux étudiants, aux professeurs et aux collaborateurs de l'Institut. Vous êtes normalement une centaine dans cette salle, à la Maison de la Paix, et un tiers d'entre vous est étudiant. Donc, bienvenue aux nouveaux étudiants, welcome back aux premières années qui passent en seconde et aux secondes qui recevront leur diplôme ce vendredi et seront alors de tout jeunes alumni. Je vous souhaite d'ores et déjà la bienvenue dans notre grande communauté. Il y aura alors 55 ans qui sépareront l'obtention de votre diplôme du jour où celui qui ce soir est le plus ancien gradué de la salle a obtenu le sien. C'était en 1965, même moi je n'étais pas encore née, et il a été le directeur général du CICR et du comité de l'Association des Anciens. Il est le premier à avoir pu rendre visite à Nelson Mandela dans sa prison de Rhode Island. Et ceci est une réponse à une des questions du quiz que nous avons créé à l'occasion de cette réunion des alumni. J'ai nommé Monsieur Jacques Moreillon. Merci d'être là, Jacques. Vous êtes plus de 350 à participer en ligne. Vous êtes connectés depuis plus de 70 pays, 70 pays. Et je tenais également à saluer tout particulièrement un alumnus qui a obtenu son master en 1959, son doctorat en 1962. Il s'agit de Pedro Reiser, qui a lui aussi effectué une brillante carrière, notamment comme CEO de Syngenta. Donc merci à vous d'être avec nous ce soir, Pedro. Et puis, je souligne encore que l'événement est enregistré et qu'à la fin de la session, nous vous proposerons à tous et toutes d'ouvrir vos caméras en ligne pour que nous puissions vous voir tous ici sur le grand écran et apprécier en images le cosmopolitisme que nous représentons. Pour la prochaine heure, je vous propose l'agenda suivant. D'abord, une assemblée générale éclair avec un rappel des priorités récentes du comité et de l'Association des Anciens. Ensuite, une conversation au coin du feu avec notre nouvelle directrice qui nous fait l'honneur et l'amitié de sa première apparition publique, Madame Marilor Salès. Merci pour cela. Et enfin, une discussion avec la participation de 3 de nos professeurs et de notre directrice sur les conséquences du Covid sur les systèmes et politiques internationales de demain. J'espère que vous aurez autant de plaisir à partager cet événement avec nous que nous en avons eu à le préparer pour vous. J'appelle maintenant Jason Shalaby, and we'll switch to English to present him. So Jason is the Director of Global Health Policy at the Novartis Foundation, where he has held several global health initiatives in Senegal, Ghana, and Vietnam. Prior to this, he served as Deputy Director at the NGO Village Health Works. He was also a program fellow at the Clinton Global Initiative and worked on the environmental initiatives team at the World Economic Forum. Jason holds a Master in International Affairs from the Graduate Institute.
Thank you, Karine. So good evening, everyone. Bonsoir à tous. So I want to welcome you all to this year's annual alumni gathering. I want to thank all the students, all the professors, and all our friends of the alumni who are joining us today in person and online. I also want to extend a warm welcome to you, new director, Marilor. It's a pleasure to have you here, especially when you join us just one week into the job. So every year since 2013, we have organized annual reunions in Geneva. These reunions allow us to express the solidarity amongst our alumni, and it's basically a time for us to celebrate our accomplishments. So just last year, for example, Julie Mélichard won last year's Alumni of the Year for her humanitarian work for distressed migrants crossing the Mediterranean Sea. And this is just 2 years after graduating. So it just shows, again, the caliber of our students, and we use this as a means for us to really celebrate our student body. Now, this year may have a different feel and is unprecedented, but it remains a unique moment for us to all connect, and I'm still amazed by how many of you are online with us today. That said, Karine has reminded me that the boat is already reserved for next year, so I hope you'll all be able to join us again over there on the reunion next year in September when things have normalized. So I'm joined today by two committee members, Walid Abdel-Nasser and Jennifer Blanca, who you'll get to meet later on this evening. But I also want to recognize all of our colleagues online who are joining us today. We have Natalie Africa, who's the president of the committee, who's based in South Africa. We also have Ting Feng, who's our treasurer, and he's based in Beijing. We also have Jessica Byron in Trinidad and Tobago, and Frédéric Santerre, who's now in France, and Brad Ryder from Canada. Now, each year, this committee comes together for its General Assembly to present an update on the activities of the alumni. But as you've seen, it's much shortened today. And so what we've done is we've sent through the invitation for this evening's event a PowerPoint that shows the priorities and status of our accounts. We basically ask all of you that if you have any comments or further questions to let us know after this event and to send it to the alumni office. But otherwise, we'll consider these as approved for now. Now, as a committee, one thing that's been really exciting over the past few years is just to see our alumni representation grow. This map was definitely not as red as you see it now. And for us, it's really exciting to see that this community has reached 20,000 members. 4,000 of them are connected on LinkedIn. We have 40 chapters and 20 ambassadors as well who represent the Institute around the world. And for us, this is just a way to see our growing kind of basically opportunity to really shed a positive light on the Institute and what it can be done to really extend its reach around the world. So just in the past few months, we have seen Ghana and South Africa create new chapters. Shanghai has also renewed its own chapter. And again, this is exemplifying the geographic reach that the institution is taking. So for all the students who are here with us tonight, our hope is that you'll be able to find a corresponding chapter that can support you as you pursue your careers once you have graduated from the Institute. So we're also proud to have 3 active scholarships as part of the alumni work and hope to build more in the years to come. We also have an Alumni Prize that is given out every year, and we want to celebrate Damien and Caio for their own work, and they'll be receiving 1,000 Swiss francs for Best Thesis of the Year. Now, one thing I did want to highlight is that usually we have a tombola or a raffle at every reunion every year as part of this scholarship work. And so the alumni office will be sending, as part of the follow-up, a call to donate to all of its network. So for those of you who do wish to support a student in their studies, this will be an opportunity for you to do so. Now I'll share one last thought. COVID-19 has definitely disrupted all of our lives, but it has also enabled us to rethink how the Institute can connect with its alumni. So after successful webinars with many professors over the past few months, we see now an opportunity to really have future events, and this will be done on a regular basis for the alumni to connect to its professors. And I want to highlight that one is already organized on September 24th with the Professor Mahmoud Mohamedou from the International History Department, and we'll send further details as well as part of the follow-up for this meeting. So it's now clear for us that hybrid and physical events will be the new way to strengthen this community. And we look forward to suggestions on how we can foster this exchange, whether it be topics across regions or other topics of interest to the student body or the alumni. And we'd love for you to as well engage with us and let us know any ideas that you may have for us to do so. So with that, I thank you once more for joining us tonight and hope that you'll enjoy the following conversations with our distinguished guests. I also would like to say that nothing can be done without Karine Le and her team. And here, I just want to say that you have been a wonderful mother to us all of the alumni, and thank you again for everything that you do.
So thank you, Jason, for these kind words, and congrats for meeting the challenge to run this General Assembly in 7 minutes. Well done. We will now switch to the fireside conversation with Larsell. Marilor is the former dean of the School of Management and Innovation of Sciences Po Paris and a university professor at the Sciences Po Center of Organizational Sociology. She was previously professor at ESSEC Business School and director there of the Center of Research on Capitalism, Globalization, and Governance. Larsell research work focuses on the contemporary transformation of capitalism, the international dissemination of ideas and practices, the spreading of globalization and the dynamics of regulation and governance in a globalized world, the social responsibility of companies and their political role in this context. Marilor holds a PhD from Harvard and is Doctor Honoris Causa of the University of Stockholm. So, ladies and gentlemen, please give a warmer welcome to the new director of the Graduate Institute, Mrs. Larsell. And even you behind your computer, you can also clap your hands. So thank you for being here. Larsell will be interviewed by Walid Mahmoud Abdel Nasser, director of the Regional Bureau of the Arab Countries at the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO. As a career Egyptian diplomat, Walid has served as chief of cabinet of the Egyptian foreign minister. He was assigned to the US and Japan, as well as in Geneva as permanent representative of Egypt to the UN. Walid received his PhD in political science from the Graduate Institute. Thank you, Walid, please.
Bonsoir, Madame la Directrice. Ça me donne un grand honneur et un grand plaisir pour être avec vous ici et merci beaucoup encore, comme Jason a déjà dit, pour être avec nous dans cette réunion de l'Assemblée générale des anciens. Pas beaucoup de questions, trois questions, si vous me permettez, adressées à vous. Je sais bien que vous étiez là pour une semaine, presque une semaine. Mais aussi pour les anciennes, nous voulons avoir une idée de votre pensée de la future, de l'avenir de l'Institut, l'avenir de relations avec les anciens et aussi la coopération entre les anciens et l'administration et la faculté ici à l'Institut. Donc, si vous me permettez, je commence avec la première question. Vous étiez déjà ici à l'Institut une fois comme un professeur invité, une fois comme un fellow invité à la Global Governance Program. Donc, vous déjà connaissez l'Institut un peu. Mais après et avant, vous avez beaucoup d'expériences dehors de l'Institut et aussi dehors de la Suisse. Cette expérience était aussi dans de différents contextes et de différents... on dit différentes institutions académiques. Donc, comment pensez-vous à ce moment-là que vos multiples expériences dans des domaines différents peuvent profiter votre nouvel poste en tant que directrice de l'Institut de formuler la politique de l'Institut dans l'avenir et aussi pour formuler ou coordonner les orientations générales de l'Institut dans les prochaines années. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Walid. Déjà, je voudrais commencer par vous dire bonsoir à toutes et à tous, ici, physiquement à Genève, mais aussi virtuellement. Je ne vous vois pas, vous êtes quelque part tous en ligne, et donc je voudrais vraiment vous dire bonsoir ou bonjour. Évidemment, tout dépend de là où vous êtes. Je voudrais aussi remercier Karine et puis l'ensemble des membres du comité des alumni pour m'avoir invité et avoir organisé cet événement dans les circonstances qu'on a décrites, qui sont des circonstances, il faut bien le dire, très très particulières et qui imposent des contraintes, mais qui créent aussi, comme vous l'avez souligné, des opportunités, comme l'a souligné Jason en particulier. Je pense qu'en effet, ce nouveau monde, avec ses contraintes, mais aussi ses opportunités, va peut-être nous permettre de réinventer nos liens, les liens entre l'Institut et les alumni, et de finalement peut-être les renforcer grâce à des mécanismes auxquels on n'aurait pas pensé en temps normal et qui s'imposent aujourd'hui dans un contexte où on ne peut pas faire autrement. Donc on va essayer de revenir, bien sûr, quand même, je pense et j'espère, à des modes de rencontres physiques. Je ne pense pas qu'on puisse à terme se passer de se voir, de se rencontrer, que ce soit dans les différents chapitres lors de voyages des uns ou des autres représentants de l'Institut, ou que ce soit ici à Genève d'une manière ou d'une autre à terme. Mais je pense qu'on va pouvoir sans doute utiliser ces nouvelles, enfin non pas très nouvelles d'ailleurs, mais ces technologies en tout cas utilisées de manière nouvelle dans nos institutions pour approfondir nos liens, pour les enrichir. Je reviendrai là-dessus. Mais je vais revenir à votre question, Valide. Excusez-moi de ce préambule peut-être un petit peu long. Alors, pour répondre à votre question, je pense je voudrais d'abord souligner quelque chose qui ne ressort pas de compétences transférables, qui ressort vraiment d'une identité intellectuelle forte entre l'Institut et ce que je suis en tant que chercheur, mais aussi sans doute ce que je suis dans mes valeurs. Et ça, c'est quelque chose qui était une des raisons pour lesquelles je suis venue à l'Institut comme professeur visitant et chercheur visitant il y a 5 ans maintenant, en 2016, enfin, pas tout à fait 5 ans. Et les travaux de l'Institut, ou plus exactement mes travaux de recherche, sont totalement inscrits finalement dans le positionnement de l'Institut. Transdisciplinarité, regard sur les questions toujours avec un angle transnational et international, compréhension du monde comme un ensemble, non pas dans un découpage disciplinaire. La crise du Covid que nous vivons aujourd'hui est une crise sanitaire, bien sûr, mais c'est aussi une crise sociale, une crise économique, une crise politique. On ne peut pas la regarder que à travers un seul angle. Donc cette notion que Marcel Mauss appelait le fait social total est une manière de regarder le monde qui, je crois, correspond très bien à ce que fait l'Institut et a toujours été ma manière de regarder le monde. Donc je crois que dans un premier temps, un des éléments, une des raisons peut-être pour laquelle il faudrait peut-être essayer de me faire confiance, je ne sais pas, j'espère, c'est cette proximité, cette identité même intellectuelle, je pense, entre l'Institut et ce que je suis en tant que chercheur et dans les valeurs que je peux porter. Ensuite, on passe aux compétences transférables, donc qui sont, on dit ça dans le monde de l'entreprise, transferable skills. Donc ces choses que vous apprenez dans un endroit, dans des situations particulières et que vous pouvez utiliser dans des situations très différentes. Donc dans ces compétences transférables, parmi celles que je pense pouvoir mobiliser ici dans ma nouvelle aventure avec vous toutes et vous tous à l'Institut, il y a mon expérience de manager d'institutions académiques. J'ai eu, au-delà de mes responsabilités à Sciences Po, auparavant, lorsque j'étais à l'ESSEC, j'ai été doyen des professeurs, ce qui serait l'équivalent à l'Institut d'un mélange entre le rôle de Director of Studies and Director of Research. Donc c'était un peu un mélange de ces deux rôles. J'ai été aussi directrice du programme doctoral que j'avais en fait lancé à l'époque, en tout cas dans sa version internationale, puisque l'ESSEC à l'époque avait un doctorat français et j'avais totalement repensé le programme pour le transformer en un PhD international. Donc j'ai des compétences de manager dans le monde académique que j'espère pouvoir transférer au-delà des différences entre toutes ces institutions ici à l'Institut. Une autre compétence transférable qui est liée mais qui n'est pas exactement la même, c'est ce que j'appellerais un peu un entrepreneuriat académique. C'est-à-dire qu'au-delà du management, j'ai aussi été impliquée dans des projets qui étaient dans des projets de création ou de réinvention. J'ai mentionné le programme doctoral à l'ESSEC, mais l'école que j'ai construite à Sciences Po, qui est une école de management et d'innovation, n'existait pas avant mon arrivée. C'est moi qui ai porté ce projet, qui l'ai inscrit dans l'identité de la maison mère Sciences Po, et évidemment la greffe n'était pas forcément évidente à penser. Inscrire une école de management dans une institution universitaire en sciences humaines et sociales comme les Sciences Po, c'était pas évident parce qu'il fallait à la fois respecter cette identité forte de la maison mère tout en s'inscrivant dans un champ de compétition, de coopétition, on va dire, qui sont le monde des management schools et des business schools, qui est très, très, très unique et très particulier. Et je pense que cette compétence-là que j'ai pu acquérir à travers ce projet, elle peut s'avérer utile aujourd'hui dans cette phase qui va être une phase de réinvention du projet de l'Institut dans un monde qui est extrêmement différent différent de celui évidemment des années 50, mais aussi de celui de 16 ans auparavant, lorsque Philippe Burin avait repris les rênes de cette maison. Le monde a beaucoup changé, et donc rester qui nous sommes va exiger de nous transformer de manière assez significative. Donc si nous voulons rester finalement fidèles à notre identité profonde, nous devons pour cela nous réinventer en profondeur, et cette expérience en fait d'entrepreneur dans le monde éducatif, j'espère pouvoir, dans le monde de l'enseignement supérieur, j'espère pouvoir le transférer ici. Je rajouterai peut-être un dernier point, qui est le fait que je sois une femme, et c'est pas simplement le fait d'être une femme, c'est le fait que être une femme dans le monde académique et dans le monde du management de l'académie, c'est un défi, on va dire ça comme ça. D'abord, il y en a peu, il y en a très très peu, je ne mentionnerai pas les chiffres, mais il y en a très peu. Le fait d'être une femme, de ne pas être suisse, d'être décalée donc un petit peu par rapport à ce qu'on pourrait attendre d'un directeur, ou ce qu'on a pu attendre jusqu'à maintenant d'un directeur de l'IHEID, je crois que c'est une manière positive de pouvoir renforcer ce qui fait la force de cet institut, c'est-à-dire son ancrage dans un respect de la diversité, dans un respect de l'ouverture, de la compréhension des autres et de l'autre. Et je pense que j'espère pouvoir porter ça ici à l'Institut, de par qui je suis, de par les expériences que m'ont valu d'être femme dans ce milieu, qui est un milieu qui reste très, très masculin.
Merci beaucoup, Marilor. Votre réponse est vraiment très compréhensive. Merci beaucoup. Et la perspective était vraiment assez large pour adresser différentes questions. Mais le point que vous avez mentionné, le dernier point, c'est très important concernant la diversité, parce que ça me rappelle que c'est arrivé lundi de la semaine dernière dans le farewell pour l'ancien directeur. Philippe Burin, quand il y avait, je crois, une professeure ici qui a dit quand il était pour la première fois à l'Institut, c'était un institut de hommes et de blancs. Donc maintenant, ça a changé, mais ça n'a pas assez changé. Donc avec vous, à la tête de l'Institut, je crois, il y a un grand changement, j'espère, bien sûr, pour le mieux. Si vous me permettez, pour la deuxième question, c'est une question liée avec la relation entre l'Institut et les anciens. Parce que maintenant, dans tout le monde, on a beaucoup d'anciens qui, vraiment, ils ont des postes très importants, soit dans leur gouvernement, soit dans l'organisation internationale, de l'institution académique, le secteur privé, le multinational, tout ça. Donc, c'est une bonne ressource pour l'Institut. Si, je sais que toujours c'est un peu tôt, mais si on peut avoir une idée, si vous avez à ce stade quelques idées, comment vous pouvez utiliser les anciens de l'Institut pour pas seulement la promotion de l'Institut, mais aussi renforcer les relations entre les anciens et leur comité avec l'Institut, avec vous bien sûr, l'administration, avec aussi les étudiants et les facultés. Même si vous avez des idées générales, ça sera utile, et peut-être dans une autre fois après, une prochaine occasion, on peut discuter plus à cet égard. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup pour cette question importante. Je voudrais commencer par dire que, bien évidemment, l'écriture de la prochaine page de l'histoire de l'Institut, c'est pas quelque chose qui va se faire par une personne toute seule au 8e étage de ce magnifique bâtiment. C'est quelque chose qui exige un travail commun, un travail collectif. Alors bien sûr, avec les parties prenantes internes, toutes les parties prenantes internes de cette très belle maison, que ce soit la faculté, que ce soit toutes les équipes administratives, que ce soit les étudiants, et on peut mettre dans l'interne, bien sûr, aussi le conseil de fondation, qui est vraiment un élément très important. Mais ça se fera aussi, et ça passera aussi par un travail collectif avec les différents cercles de parties prenantes externes, de stakeholders, et évidemment, dans le tout premier cercle, on a les alumni, on a ce groupe de 20 000 personnes qui représentent un soutien potentiel et une aide potentielle, mais aussi qui peut, je voudrais vraiment souligner le fait que cette relation, c'est une relation à double sens, c'est-à-dire qu'il faut qu'à la fois, bien sûr, les alumni soient présents dans le futur de cette maison, mais il faut aussi que nous ayons des choses à donner aux alumni. Ça va dans les deux sens. Alors ces liens qui doivent être tissés, ça c'est clair, je pense qu'on est tous d'accord là-dessus, qui doivent être tissés de manière encore plus étroite que ce qu'ils ne sont aujourd'hui. Plusieurs choses. Il y a une première dimension qui est dans le don, enfin dans une partie importante du don que nous pouvons faire aux alumni, c'est de faire en sorte que cette maison soit toujours plus visible, toujours plus respectée, toujours plus forte dans le monde académique, mais aussi dans le monde des organisations, on va dire, des employeurs potentiels de nos alumni, jeunes ou moins jeunes. Et pour cela, évidemment, développer ce sens de la fierté à travers tout le travail que l'on va pouvoir faire pour rendre encore plus fort, visible et productif, au sens vraiment positif de ce terme, notre institut. Donc, créer les conditions pour que la fierté des alumni puissent s'exprimer par rapport à une maison qui est la leur et qu'ils voient évoluer, se transformer, porter des messages importants, diffuser de la connaissance qui est pertinente et utile au monde et aux défis d'aujourd'hui. Tout cela, ça va faire partie de ce que nous pouvons apporter aux alumni. Dans l'autre sens, toujours dans ce même sens, pardon, il y a aussi d'autres manières pour nous de renforcer les liens avec les alumni en allant dans cette direction-là. C'est de développer tout ce qui est ce qu'on appelle en franglais le lifelong learning, donc tout ce qui est les opportunités qui peuvent être très structurées, qui peuvent être sous forme de diplôme tout au long de la vie, mais qui peuvent être aussi ce dont Jason parlait très brièvement et Karine aussi, des conférences très régulières avec nos professeurs sur des sujets d'actualité, etc., qui sont des manières d'enrichir ses compétences individuellement sans avoir à faire le travail intellectuel qu'a pu faire ce professeur pour arriver à ces conclusions-là. Donc c'est un don, c'est vraiment un don intellectuel à la communauté dans ce cas-là, mais on peut en effet aussi l'envisager comme des formations continues, plus ou moins structurantes. Donc on a toute une palette, on va dire, d'offres de formation de lifelong learning qui peut être sans doute renforcée, développée, mise en évidence, et là, en effet, utiliser l'opportunité que représente ce moment un peu particulier pour développer ça, parce que je pense qu'en effet, ce sont des choses qu'on n'aurait pas peut-être fait aussi naturellement auparavant, mais qu'on va pouvoir faire. Dans l'autre sens, tisser des liens plus étroits avec nos alumni, ça va aussi bien sûr dans l'autre sens. Et ça passe, je crois, surtout et avant tout par un engagement de nos alumni auprès et pour nos étudiants, sous des formes très très différentes, qui vont de la présence dans les enseignements, sous tout un tas de formes différentes. Et évidemment, vu les postes qu'occupent aujourd'hui nos alumni, les voir revenir dans les salles de cours, c'est extrêmement important et extrêmement utile pour nos étudiants. Et ça, c'est très net. Sous la forme aussi, bien sûr, d'opportunités de stage, d'opportunités de recrutement, évidemment, bien sûr, pour nos étudiants. Donc, tout et là, il faut le voir comme allant à double sens, parce que, évidemment, de très bons étudiants recrutés par nos alumni sont une vraie valeur ajoutée pour nos alumni dans les organisations qui sont les leurs. Et puis après, il y a, bien sûr, une implication à travers des événements, les conférences, qui sont des moments très importants pour nous, à travers peut-être des programmes de mentoring. Je sais que vous avez essayé de mettre cela en place et on en rediscutera certainement pour voir quelles sont les meilleures manières d'aller dans cette direction-là. Et puis aussi, à travers ce que vous avez commencé à faire, soutien très réel et très concret et très matériel, qui sont toutes les formes de soutien financier aux étudiants et au-delà à l'Institut, bien sûr, qui sont par définition dans un deuxième temps, qui servent finalement nos étudiants. Donc tous ces liens qui existent déjà, essayés par tous les moyens que l'on pourra discuter ensemble et que l'on pourra explorer ensemble, de les renforcer avec cette idée fondamentale qui est que l'avenir de cette maison s'écrit ensemble.
Si vous avez mentionné le mentoring, j'étais en train de rappeler ce que Nathalie, notre présidente, a mentionné concernant cette question, parce que je crois que ça sera aussi une valeur additionnelle pour la coopération entre l'Institut et les anciens, j'espère ça, oui. Ma troisième et dernière question concerne, c'est-à-dire où l'Institut se trouve. C'est-à-dire l'Institut se trouve ici en Suisse, au cœur de l'Europe, mais aussi à côté des organisations internationales, à côté de beaucoup de centres académiques et centres de recherche très importants en Suisse et en France, et même en Europe. Donc, comment vous pensez que l'Institut peut profiter de cette location stratégique de l'Institut concernant soit enrichir le programme scolaire de l'Institut ou même les autres activités de l'Institut dans le domaine avec les anciens, avec les organisations internationales, comme de stages, comme même de formation, programmes de formation, tout ça. Aussi, je n'anticipe pas une réponse très complète de votre part, mais si vous pouvez partager avec les anciens, s'il vous plaît, deux idées à cet égard. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Walid. C'est une question évidemment éminemment importante qui, il faut bien le dire, ne se pose pas exactement de la même manière aujourd'hui qu'il n'y a serait-ce qu'il y a un an. Dans la mesure où aujourd'hui, dans le contexte actuel, ce qu'il faut bien voir, c'est que la mondialisation du monde universitaire, qui était vraiment en marche très rapide sur les 20 dernières années, qui était allée très très loin, on avait vraiment une facilité d'établir des partenariats, de les faire vivre surtout de manière physique, réelle, d'avoir des échanges très très réguliers d'étudiants, de professeurs, etc., qui aujourd'hui n'est pas tout à fait la même, en tout cas pour une période de temps que bien peu d'entre nous pourraient essayer de deviner quelle longueur ça va représenter. Donc on est dans une situation un petit peu particulière, qui est que sur le fond, et bien évidemment notre identité internationale au sens le plus large du terme reste là et vraiment est revendiquée de manière très forte. Mais il est clair aussi que, et on le voit par exemple sur les chiffres d'échange dès cette rentrée, on va avoir une pause dans tout ce qui peut être dimension physique d'échange avec nos partenariats internationaux. Je le vois comme une opportunité à mon arrivée, où vous pouvez l'imaginer, un peu beaucoup de choses à découvrir et à voir, pour finalement ne pas me concentrer tout de suite sur la dimension des partenariats internationaux, ou quelque part qui est un petit peu aussi dans ma nature d'animal académique avec une carrière internationale. Là, ça va me forcer, et peut-être ça va nous forcer au niveau institutionnel, à voir quelles sont les opportunités et à essayer de développer ces opportunités au niveau régional, donc Europe au sens large, mais aussi vraiment au niveau de la Suisse, du canton de Genève. Et donc là, il y a plusieurs directions qui sont, à mon avis, intéressantes. Une première direction, c'est la notion de transdisciplinarité au-delà des sciences humaines et sociales. Je pense qu'un grand nombre des défis que nous auxquels nous avons à faire face aujourd'hui indique bien que la transdisciplinarité dont nous avons besoin ne s'arrête pas juste aux frontières des sciences humaines et sociales. Et donc travailler avec nos partenaires académiques suisses, des écoles d'ingénieurs, des écoles de design, de l'université, de différents départements de l'université ou des universités, me paraît être un chemin très important à développer. Et je vais vraiment essayer de développer ce dialogue ou cette discussion avec nos partenaires. Je dois dire que très spontanément, ils se sont mis, pour un grand nombre d'entre eux, en contact avec moi déjà, et je pense que je vais donc explorer ce chemin-là. Un autre chemin, bien sûr, non pas à explorer, parce qu'il est exploré depuis très longtemps, mais peut-être à repenser ou à réinventer, c'est celui de nos liens avec la Genève internationale, internationale, toutes les organisations qui la composent, qu'elles soient vraiment transnationales ou qu'elles soient plus liées à l'histoire de la Suisse, donc dans les deux dimensions. Et je pense qu'on est tous très conscients des défis que rencontre aujourd'hui le multilatéralisme dans notre monde, et que ce multilatéralisme, pour survivre là aussi, doit se réinventer probablement en profondeur. Et je pense que l'Institut a évidemment un rôle important, intellectuel important à jouer dans ce travail de réinvention et de reformulation. Et donc travailler avec nos partenaires de longue date à un projet qui est extrêmement enthousiasmant, qui est comment peut-on repenser une collaboration internationale dans un monde qui aujourd'hui, en tout cas sous sa forme actuelle, est de plus en plus clairement dans un rejet de cette collaboration-là. Je pense que ce deuxième axe, en tout cas moi, m'interpelle. J'ai commencé à en parler à un certain nombre de nos partenaires dans la Genève internationale qui ont l'air d'être vraiment sur la même longueur d'onde. Donc j'ai bon espoir, en effet, que l'on puisse avancer sur ces deux axes. Ça, encore une fois, ne remet aucunement en cause notre identité d'organisation d'institutions internationales et toute notre projection dans un partenariat dense au niveau international. Mais il est clair qu'on va avoir une période dans laquelle on va peut-être essayer de rééquilibrer un petit peu.
Well, thank you very much for this really overreaching perspective, and there are a lot of horizons that you have opened and you have shared with us in this session. I know it's, again, we caught you at a very early point of your new post as director of the Institute, but I think this was very enriching for all of us, and I would ask you all to give a big applaud for the new director.
Thank you, Walid. Thank you very much.
Donc nous allons maintenant passer à la partie table ronde. Pour celles et ceux qui sont en ligne, vous pouvez d'ores et déjà commencer à envoyer vos questions en les soumettant dans la colonne Q&R de votre écran. Et j'appelle maintenant le professeur Nico Krisch. Nico is a professor of international law and former co-director of the Global Governance Center at the Graduate Institute. His main research interests concern the legal structure of international organization and global governance, the politics of international law, and the post-national legal order emerging at the intersection of domestic, transnational, and international law. Nico holds a PhD in law from the University of Heidelberg. Suri Moon is co-director of the Global Health Center. Her work is broadly concerned with the intersection of global governance and public health. Her theoretical contributions to the field including conceptualizing the global health system, defining the function the system must perform to adequately protect public health, global health goods for health, and identifying the types of governance gaps and power disparities that contribute to health inequity. Suri holds a PhD in public policy from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Thank you. Finally, Shalini Randeria. So Shalini is professor of social anthropology and sociology at the Graduate Institute and also rector of the Institute of Human Sciences in Vienna, where she is at the moment. She has published widely on the anthropology of globalization, law, the state, and social movement. Her empirical research on India also addresses issues of post-coloniality and multiple modernities. And I'm finally super happy to welcome back from Abidjan Jennifer Blanca, who will moderate the panel. Jennifer is non-executive director at African Risk Capacity Insurance Company Limited, From February 2017 to July this year, she was Vice President, Agriculture, Human and Social Development at the African Development Bank Group. Prior to that, she was Chief Economist at the World Economic Forum. Jennifer holds an MA and a PhD in International Economics from the Graduate Institute. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karine, and I'm delighted to be here. As many of you know who have been in these events in the past, we always place emphasis on the intellectual nature of what our gatherings can bring, and really taking advantage of the fact that we have such wonderful and knowledgeable professors. And we could not think of any topic that would be more timely and front of mind than COVID-19 and the impacts of COVID-19 over the longer term. And so, you know, I mean, we know, I don't have to remind everybody, especially everybody online, but everybody in here wearing masks, that this was a health crisis, still is, that really spilled over for many reasons into an economic crisis as we dealt with that. And then, you know, arose many other crises, whether there were food crises and even political crises, crises of democracy. And so this is what we're faced with. And perhaps we could be somewhat depressed, and I'm sure we'll hear some difficult points of view. But what we thought would be really interesting was to bring together, as you've heard, a very multidimensional panel of experts, of professors from the Institute to look at this issue from various lenses. And so what I'll do is I will open up by asking a few questions just to sort of get the lay of the land from the professors, kind of going logically through from public health to other issues. And then what I'll do is I will open it up first to the room if people have some questions, and then, as Karine mentioned, also taking some questions online. And of course, you can ask your questions either in English or French. And so with limited time, so Suri, of course, I will start with you, given your expertise in the area of public health. Given what you're seeing right now and how we're struggling and finding solutions, how do you see the COVID crisis impacting public health and health systems more generally?
It's a great great question. First, let me just thank you so much for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here and honor to be participating in this panel. And really an honor to be with all of the alumni. I'm a relatively new member of the Graduate Institute community. I started teaching in 2016, but I think over the years I hope to have a chance to meet many more of you in person today and in future years, as we can hopefully begin to gather in person more often. But on the question of health systems, I think it's a really important one to begin with, because this is, of course, it began, as you rightly said, as a health crisis. And I think one of the conclusions that we can draw about health systems, yes, absolutely, COVID has exposed weaknesses in health systems. And normally, when we think about outbreaks, we have thought about weaknesses, particularly in low and middle income countries. Outbreaks have been portrayed as a development challenge. And of course, they are absolutely a development challenge, but they are not only a development challenge. I think I don't need to remind anybody in this room or following us online that this outbreak has, of course, exposed the weaknesses in health systems across the wealthiest, most powerful, and most technologically advanced countries, including here in Europe, and of course also in North America. And I do think this is a very important aspect of the crisis, because what it reminds us of is that how we measure the strength of a health system is perhaps not just on the traditional indicators, how many doctors or nurses, how much GDP, how much money, how many hospitals. But we also have to think about the capacity of the state. And I think one of the things that we see in COVID is that a strong state, a capable state, has been really essential. And what do I mean by that? I don't mean a strong state that is able to enforce difficult measures such as quarantines or lockdowns, but I mean a state that is able to make politically difficult decisions, such as impose imposing lockdowns, a state that is able to be agile and to respond to changing information, changing understanding about the disease, changing understanding about how do we actually get this thing under control, a state that is able to ensure that the most vulnerable are protected, whether that's biomedically vulnerable or, of course, those who are living in poverty or who are exposed because they're at the lower end of a socioeconomic spectrum. And finally, what we don't often think about as state strength, but we're seeing very, very clearly exposed in this crisis, is a state that is trusted by the population. And this is something that I think we often forget in terms of what is a health system. It's not just medical workers and hospitals, though of course that's really essential. It's also the population, and in fact it's society that co-produces health. And we see this, the fact that all of you are here wearing masks, agreeing to wear masks, agreeing to observe, all of the rules that have been put in place and have been imposed on us is a reflection of the fact that the population is what we call a co-producer of health. It is, in fact, part of the health system. And I think COVID has reminded us of that in a way that other crises really, really have not. I think the second response I have with respect to health systems is that we really need to look beyond the national health system. When we use the phrase health system, many people think about the national level, but we also have a global health system. And we have a global health system, again, whose weaknesses have been very much exposed by this epidemic. And I think one of the weaknesses that's been exposed is that it's a system that has largely been built through the logic of development aid. If we look at all of the big global health initiatives built here in Geneva, the majority of the money, the majority of the attention has been on global health as a development challenge. And many people still think of global health as only pertaining to developing countries. And of course, yes, it is a development challenge, but again, not only. And I think one of the ways in which we see the weaknesses of the global health system that we've built is that we have not built strong institutions. We don't have strong international laws or rules that actually govern health for everybody, including for the high-income countries. And a very concrete example of this is what we see going on now with scramble for access to COVID vaccines, in which there is no framework, there are no agreements for how do we allocate vaccines in a way that will be effective from a public health perspective and that will be equitable from an ethical perspective across all countries. We simply don't have any real systems for that. So we're trying to build these very quickly. We're trying to build the airplane and fly it at the same time and put in place systems to do that. But it really highlights that, in fact, we don't have those agreements in place. And so high-income countries that have capacity to manufacture vaccines, what we see happening is that they are, in fact, securing all of the supply, leaving a very, very small slice of the pie that is left for multilateral governance. And this leads me to the last point that I really wanted to highlight, which is what do we mean when we need a strong global health system? We have to strengthen the systems that we have at the international level. This means that we have to have, of course, a stronger WHO, and I think many of you have been following the debates about the World Health Organization, and we need to have strengthened multilateralism. But what does that mean in an era of course, rising nationalism? And I want to pause here and just say that I really am grateful, and I think that I'm grateful and I want to really recognize the hard work of our colleagues up the hill at WHO. People have been working night and day since January now, nonstop, really at the epicenter of the global response to this crisis. But oftentimes without the financing that they need, without the legal authority that they need, and without the political space that they need to operate. And so really the big question, and I really am curious to hear what the other members of the panel and all of the alumni have to say on this. For me, the big question is, can we have a multilateral order when some of the most important players, so the United States and China, to be more explicit, are not supporting that multilateral order? And again, if I go back to the vaccines example to illustrate more concretely, in this scramble for vaccines, there has been an effort to govern multilaterally access to vaccines. It's something called the COVAX facility, but the US is not participating, and China appears not to be participating. And so what we see is left in the middle, many countries still very much relying on a multilateral system. 170 countries that have said, we support this multilateral solution. We need and rely on a multilateral solution, but effectively a very, very shrinking small slice of the pie that's left for multilateral governance. So I think that the big question is, can we build a post-COVID world in which we strengthen and salvage that multilateral system when two of the biggest players are not playing that game?
That is a very interesting question, and I think comes back to this sense of every man for himself, both at the international level as well as at the national level. And I'm sure it's something that we will delve into a little bit more. And I love this idea of society co-producing health. And with that, maybe, Shalini, we can move to you if you can hear us. We're going to see if the technology cooperates. Okay, you nodded, that's good. You know, your expertise, just going back to that part of the discussion, your expertise is really in society and democracy. And how do you see, how is democracy being transformed, really, by what we're seeing now? And, you know, what are the sort of reactions that people are having around the world to the COVID situation? Shalini?
So thank you very much. Jen, thank you very much for allowing me to participate remotely. I hope you can hear me. Like Suri, let me make 3 points, and then I hope we can discuss these together. So the first point I'd like to make is that there is, interestingly, no really clear evidence that democracies have dealt with the pandemic better than authoritarian systems. I think the evidence shows that elected governments in the US and the UK have made an utter mess of protecting especially the vulnerable sections of their population, in imposing the public health measures that are necessary, etc. I don't want to go into the reasons here, but I just want to flag the point that it's not as if all democracies have done equally well, and some of democracies have done actually quite badly. China, on the other hand, has done relatively well. It did not ever have a complete national lockdown. It managed to have very local lockdowns, and the mortality rate was much lower than many of the other countries where the virus spread. So we need to think about what that as a demonstration effect is going to do for the disenchantment with democracy worldwide. Now, this disappointment with democracy is not a result of COVID. Like Suri, the point I would like to make is that the virus has really exposed the faults within fault lines and the strong problems which are already existent in our society. So they're not produced by COVID, but it has exposed the dangers of ethno-nationalism. It has shown what the closing of borders, which was needed, but gives a fillip to anti-immigration rhetoric and policies. What does erosion of human rights do in such a situation when civil liberties do need to be curtailed? The question is, are these restrictions going to remain for much longer, or are they really also going to be slowly fading away? The whole question of the deepening of inequalities of race, of gender, of generation, which we have seen in the wake of this pandemic, these are, of course, as I said, they are not caused by COVID, but the pandemic has really exposed all of these structural problems in almost every democratic society. The second point I want to make is that the virus of soft authoritarianism is creeping in on us very slowly. And with that, I want to say 2 things. One, that it is becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish carefully between what is a democracy and what is no longer a democracy. The line has got so blurred in the meanwhile that we really often have a problem in showing here is a lead line which has been crossed, and this is no longer a democracy. democracy, although all the formal trappings of democracy are there, the leaders have been elected, they've been elected in reasonably fair and free elections, but nevertheless, these are leaders who are not interested in sharing power, they are not interested in dissent being expressed in their societies. There is enormous violent repression of protests, not only in Belarus, but also in the US, as we have seen. So we could call these sort of soft authoritarian systems, which, some people have called them elected autocracies, people have called them the new despotism. But the problem here is that while democratic procedures are intact, all liberal principles have been, institutions, principles, values are being dismantled. But interestingly, they're being dismantled gradually and by democratic means. So they have not been dismantled by a military coup as we used to know it, where we could see there is a change in system. Here, there is a gradual, slow dismantling of democracy from within, hollowing it out by using the law, using constitutions to hollow out the rule of law, to transform democratic systems with little accountability, with little interest in power sharing, and using the increasingly polarized nature of a lot of these democracies, which are, as I said, not a result of COVID. They were there before, but these have increased the tensions, the fears and anxieties within society. Last point I want to make is that I think we are seeing very ambivalent tendencies. The one I want to pick up is the one that Suri just mentioned, trust. A strong state is one where the citizens trust the state. We have seen under COVID is a very schizophrenic reaction. The trust in experts has increased. I think all of us now have a favorite virologist of our own. Many of us have turned into sort of hobby statisticians. But if you think of someone like Dr. Fauci, but not only him, even the German virologists who have been making a strong case for lockdowns, etc., they are heroes to some and villains to the others. So they have not only become objects of hatred, but they and their families have received even death threats. So it shows you the extent of polarization. So yes, an increase in trust and expertise, and simultaneously the circulation of ever more conspiracy theories, even about the very existence of the virus. So last point on the ambivalence of some of these developments, I think one of the main problems we have is that the countervailing institutions, which we need to protect our democracies, to strengthen them, to deepen them, have all suffered. Courts have not been functioning or only very limitedly functioning under lockdowns. The press is in deep trouble because advertisement revenues have declined enormously. Many of the kinds of restrictions which were necessary to put in place on our civil liberties, we don't know how long they are here to stay. There's been an enormous centralization of power and of administrative power rather than legislative responsibility, and public protest. Universities were closed. Public protest has become very difficult. What we see, however, in Belarus, as in the US, to stay with those two examples, massive street protests despite enormous state repression and violence. In the US, if you think of Black Lives Matter, we can see people protesting on the street despite all the restrictions about doing it, and despite health issues which may come together there. But on the other hand, what makes me really concerned is the fact that even in Germany, in Austria, and Italy, many of the protests against vaccines, against these civil liberty restrictions, etc., have been fueled by the far-right parties who are actually protesting together with sort of a white supremacist agenda, anti-immigration agenda, and are enormous fans of Trump if you see some of the T-shirts and posters which people are displaying. So it's a toxic mix, unfortunately, of crony capitalism, ethno-nationalism, majoritarian, populist, elected governments, and macho, strong men who may be here to stay. Only good news in this connection is that interestingly, most of the countries which have done so well in dealing with COVID are being run by women. So I think the health of democracy may be a little more gendered than we have seen so far.
Thanks, Shalini. Thanks for also ending on a positive note, and I'll say also maybe says something positive for having a woman director now at the Institute. Shalini warned me that she was going to paint a pretty morbid picture, so I think that that's a place where we can try to build back from, perhaps, but a breakdown in trust, erosion of democracy, and really a rise in inequality, which is also something that's been worrying me a lot. I mean, let's all remember that we're not all living the same crisis. Right? I mean, those of us who are sitting here having this conversation right now are having a very different crisis than the people I used to see when I looked out my window in Abidjan, I'll tell you. So anyway, so I have to take a bit of a breath after Shalini's because that was quite something. Now, Nico, let me turn to you and let's go from the sort of micro national image and perspective of democracy and build it up now to the international institution perspective. And what are you seeing in terms of international cooperation as being impacted? I know that Suri talked about this a bit before, but what are you seeing happen and sort of where do you see this going?
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'm not sure really I'm going to be much more cheerful than Shalini was really. So, but I'm going to try to do a bit of a picture. Of course, there's some kind of futurology involved in this, so it's all somewhat speculative, right? We're seeing some things coming out of the crisis yet, but obviously we don't really see how it is going to unfold, and we can all kind of have estimates about kind of what's going to happen, but nobody really knows. Now, obviously, what we typically think of is that sort of crises of this magnitude are kind of openers, right? So they allow for change to happen much more quickly and much more radically than would otherwise be possible. Now, what we don't know really is in which direction the change is going to go. And when we think about global cooperation and the challenges around COVID, of course, we have to keep in mind that the challenge for global cooperation happens on a backdrop that has been rather grim already for some time, right? So that we have had pretty troubled waters for the international institutional system that has been in place essentially since the Second World War for, say, 2 decades now, with increasing stagnation in the creation of new treaties, international organizations, funding squeezes, a turn to informal governance, kind of all kinds of forms that pull us away from the classical multilateral system, which all have possibly their own virtues, but certainly make for quite a different system, and the big multilateral organizations have all felt the heat, really. So it comes on that background, really, that we now get COVID. And COVID, in many ways, accelerates and kind of exacerbates the challenges that multilateral institutions and the global governance system have felt for some time. So one of the real issues that comes up more strongly because the stakes are higher is the geopolitical shift that we're seeing from west to east roughly, but especially kind of the increasing rivalry between the US and China that makes cooperation much more difficult because everything turns into a zero-sum game, and the idea that you can have institutions that work for the better of everybody becomes sidelined very quickly. So that's a big challenge. We see, and we're likely going to see more of that, a surge of anti-internationalism. We've seen this since the 2008 financial crisis in Western countries, increasingly, coupled with populism, populist nationalism that has turned against international cooperation, international institutions, everything foreign. So, of course, there's a bit of a counter movement as well. People see that there needs to be cooperation in order to deal with the crisis, but many are turning against that. And as the depression, the pandemic depression, is going to hit us harder yet than we see it now, where we still have all kinds of state programs to soften it. We're going to likely see a surge of this anti-internationalism, this populism, and this discontent, and kind of a loss of trust with public institutions that Shalini has also talked about. So that bodes ill for international institutions, because there are going to be an increasing number of governments just pushing against pretty much everything you can do. And a third factor that is going to make cooperation really difficult is the funding squeeze that is going to happen. Right? Governments are going to be impoverished, right? I think we have to be clear about that. Some governments will come out of the crisis okay, but many are going to face an enormous debt burden to deal with in the years to come, so they're not going to invest much in international institutions, right? The priorities are going to be home, dealing with the social mayhem that is going to be created by the crisis, the need to keep people out of poverty, and to keep the health system flowing. So the whole idea of sort of global cooperation for broader aims, I think, is going to be difficult to sustain, and it's going to rest on a few actors, really. So what are we going to see? Kind of speculation, really, but quite likely that we see just an exacerbation of this trend away from the idea of cooperation through common institutions. We're going to probably see a more fragmented global governance system yet than we've seen before. Some groups of states working together, and not only states, also groups of states with other actors, private actors, trying to make things happen, as we see in Geneva all over the place, right? Gavi is a good example, right, for public-private partnership trying to make things happen. We're going to see probably many more of these kinds of initiatives, but we're probably also going to see a hollowing out of the center, a hollowing out of the public nature, an increasing role of private actors, some of which have been mightily enriched by the crisis and going to keep reaping gains. They're going to call more of the shots. So I think there's this shift from the public to the private, despite the kind of reassertiveness of the state in the crisis, is going to happen just as a matter of economic shifts. And that means kind of we have a more fragmented, complex system, but really a loss of a center, I would predict.
So basically disintegration, deglobalization, maybe regionalization, and we'll have to see how that unfolds. And so maybe on that, now, let me turn to Marilor and ask you, how do you think about academia? I mean, you talked about this a little bit earlier, but how do you, first of all, see the impact of COVID on academia, but especially, given what Nico and Suri and Shalini have said, how do you see academic institutions like this one helping things along in the right direction?
So thank you. I'm not sure I'm going to be also much more cheerful than my colleagues. But let me start with the first question, which is what is likely to be the impact of COVID on academic institutions and academia in general? Some of the trends are very similar to what has just been said, in particular by Nico, but also by Shalini. One clear thing is that, I mentioned that already, the very huge movement towards globalization of academia, which really was something from the 90s forward, is going to slow down for at least a while, if not stop altogether. So we might see there too some form of deglobalization of academia, with a return maybe to regional dynamics, or even to a renationalization of academic life, which was what we had before the globalization of higher education really started for good in the 80s, 90s. So that's, it's a trend now. It all depends on whether or not we are able to find solutions in the form of vaccines or others to the current health crisis, whether or not this is going to be a sure trend or whether it's going to be just a blurb in the kind of globalization process that academia has been going through. So that's one point that we need to deal with, and we need to reinvent forms of internationalization in spite of that, I would say. And for that, I think the Institute is pretty well placed already. So that's the good news, the part of the good news on that. A second trend on academia, which we've seen already very clearly, is the fast speed virtualization. Okay, so we've moved. We never believed we would do it, actually, and we always resisted it. I'm not talking, obviously, only about the Institute. I'm talking here about academia in general, that we strongly resisted this move to online courses on big scale, etc. And we managed to do it, actually, pretty well, and particularly well at the Institute. So we managed to do it in a short period of time. And this trend is going to be with us. So there's really a challenge here, I see, because if we are letting this trend be with us fully for a long period of time, then we're really in danger of platformization. I'm not going to use the term Uberization, but that's what I mean. Academia as a whole is in danger of that, in the sense that who handles technology, some of the firms that Nico was talking about, some of the big winners of the current situation, some of the GAFAMs and others around. And you know, you can imagine if all university moves to full online in a matter of months or years and stays there, that people who actually control the technology and manage it very well can become the new providers of you know, education, if we understand education as being the circulation of knowledge or the diffusion of knowledge, much better than we can do, because they will be much better with respect to the technology, and they will have much more financial means to get the best professors, the best of our faculty members here to be working with them. So this is really, for me, a dystopic trend. It's not totally impossible. I really hope that we are not going that way. And for that, we have to be able to reaffirm what it is to be a university, what is different between a university and a platform that distributes knowledge. And we have to be able to show that through, in particular, the types of things that you just heard, the types of knowledge that is being produced in places like this one, the types of dynamics that emerge from physical setting, debates and exchanges between students, faculty, and you know, external participants to different forms of events, etc. So we have to be able to really reaffirm the specificity of the university. I think this is going to be a challenge for us, and we really need to take that challenge because indeed it's not the same thing. We are, you know, something that is much more valuable than simply a platform distributing knowledge or even producing and distributing knowledge. So that's another trend. That's the second trend. Another trend that I see as a question is really the business model. And here again, it's both a threat and an opportunity. It's very clear that our American colleagues are feeling the brunt of this, because going fully online, having a full online offering with tuition fees that are close to $70,000 a year, it's very difficult to defend in the long run. I mean, it's going to be a very tough call to defend this in the long run. And so, interestingly, if you think about this, there's maybe a counter-trend to this privatization that Nico was talking about. Because in a sense, what this would say is that we might have to come back, at least in the more enlightened democracies, to go back to Shalini's talk, we might have to go back to an understanding of education as being a common good, a public good, something that needs to be financed by states. But then at the same time, states are not going to have that much money to play around. But so here we have really a very important issue. You know, what will be the business model of higher education in general? But clearly, the fully private model that is connected to the US and has spread across the world in many, many different countries has reached its limits, will have reached its limits, I think. So for me, those are really some of the key trends. To go back to the second question, which is what is the role for us, but not only the Institute, the academia in general, and more specifically the Institute, I think it's to reaffirm the value of science and of expertise, that was mentioned already, to fight for that trust. And we do this by developing the types of scholarship that you just saw an example of with our three colleagues here. And also, if we think about the teaching part and the education part of what we do, to actually be even better than we are, even though I think the Institute is really a particularly good place for that, but we need to go much further collectively in the world of education in general towards complex thinking, towards training our students for uncertainty, structural uncertainty, not risk, uncertainty, and it makes a huge difference, and to actually equip our students also with a new, I like to call it software, which, kind of puts the software of the 1980s on its head. And then software of the 1980s, to make it simple, is, let personal greed flourish everywhere and we'll have common good. Well, no, actually we have to go back to a much more logical idea, which is that if we co-construct a common good, we'll get from that common good our personal well-being, our individual well-being. And so we need really to work to the formulation of this new software and to the co-construction of that new software, a number of partners, and in a sense, the retooling of the new generation of decision makers with that new software. I think that's where we have a role, a very important one indeed.
Thanks a lot, Marilor. And I have to say, it makes you really think, this concept of platformization, in a world where people feel that anything they don't agree with is fake news, and how important academic institutions are for safe spaces for debate, and speaking with people with other perspectives. It's a scary thought if the polarization continues and people can just choose which of the academic platforms they want to listen to, and we end up even more deep in our kind of increasingly isolated echo chambers. So let's hope that that's not where we're going. So what I would like to do, that was, I think you'll all agree, a really interesting intro to some pretty deep issues that we're all contending with right now, and also some significant opportunities. What I'd like to do, we don't have so much time left, but take a few questions in the room, if there are any, and please do stick to questions, given that we don't have much time, rather than sort of a statement or your own thoughts. I think there'll be a little bit of time for us to discuss afterwards. And if there are no questions in the room, or after we've taken a few questions in the room, I will then go online. So I think we have a question here, please. You have to, they won't hear you online if you don't take...
Hi, everyone. Thanks for allowing this panel to happen and definitely allowing us to have questions. I'm a first semester student, so I will start actually on Monday. My question is actually referring to the trust that you talked about, Suri. I came back from China, and I was there during the COVID, during the start of the pandemic. And I did see a kind of trust that occurred that was collective within the Chinese population. And there is this divide where, if you've ever been abroad, basically, there's the foreigners a lot of the time, and the natives or the locals. And so what would happen is the Chinese had this trust, this unbelievable trust in their government that I did not experience within the foreigners, or actually even saw here in Europe. Where would you place that trust, or how do you even think about constructing such incredible trust within the population for its government?
Okay, thanks. I'll take one more question and then we'll come to that. So one more here.
Thank you. My question is about the issues that you already raised in this conundrum between the role strengthening and the role of the state. The state has come back with a lot more legitimacy intervening in the economic sphere, preventing a social collapse. We will see to what extent this fall, this will really be successful. So the good part of the role of the state, which goes a little bit counterfactual to the new liberal policies of laissez-faire. So this may be looking as a promising trend. So I'm not very sure what Nico was saying with the mere fact that companies are becoming richer, or at least some of them have become richer, they would be the major player. I think that may happen, but also the private sector in general, including the big global supply chains, have been rather silent, non-intervening in preventing the social and economic collapse. They have been really trying to see how they can rescue or save their own operation. So away from what they have been announcing for SDGs and for that. So how do you see in this, and that has a lot to do with the future of multilateralism also, to what extent the state and which type of state and institutions come by, and how the private sector resets its own role in this development arena. Thank you. I would be happy if you can make some remarks on this.
Thank you. So let's start with Suri on trust, maybe. Sorry. How do you construct it? Good luck.
Thanks. I think that is a really critical question, and I'm going to punt a little bit and actually ask Shalini perhaps to step in, because I think that it's an issue that has been increasingly recognized in the public health community. I would say is the importance of trust, the decline of trust, and we see particularly not just in this outbreak, but with the growing phenomenon of vaccine hesitancy, for example, the fact that people are less and less willing to be immunized, not just for COVID, but for a whole range of illnesses. Closely linked to that is a decline of trust in science, in expertise, in traditional sources of authority. And so I think that we are not yet ahead of the game, certainly in the health community, in terms of understanding how do you build it, how do you strengthen it, how do you address it. We're still, I would say, at the stage of understanding, wow, this is a really important thing that we've not paid enough attention to before. I'm hoping that in other areas of scholarship, perhaps there has been more good empirical work or good research on how do you actually strengthen and build that. But I would say we are still really struggling to understand the repercussions and to internalize and to build the research that will help us to answer your question in a more satisfying way.
Shalini, do you want to add anything really brief to that, just in the interest of time?
Maybe just 2 sentences. I don't think any of the other disciplines has a good recipe for how to rebuild trust. I think there is a general diagnosis that there has been a dismantling and a loss of trust in political parties, in political elites, etc. And that is one of the reasons we have so much of majoritarian populist kind of leadership being elected to power. I think the question we need to ask ourselves is, can the discontent which a lot of these people are expressing, can one take that seriously without agreeing necessarily with the forms that it is taking? And I think one of the major mistakes that have been made by a lot of liberal parties, but some of even parts of the conservative parties, but across Europe, in the US, the Democrats, a big party like the Congress Party in India, etc., is that they have not really addressed the really deep structural issues which globalization has thrown up, of inequalities, of wealth, of opportunity, etc. But I think questions of corruption, questions of which are not simple questions, but the populists are providing extremely easy answers, which they are not delivering, but they are just providing these answers in an extremely polarized climate of fear. So I think, as Marilor pointed out, I think there is a huge role that universities need to play here in building, and not only just universities, because not everybody goes to university, it's also schools, which will need to play the role, education needs to play the role of furthering critical thinking, but of building a strong citizenry. I think without public engagement, there is no way that we will be able to build up the trust. The major question at the moment is, can we somehow, in societies which are so highly polarized, and not everyone is, but we are seeing greater polarization in almost every society. So the question is, how can we bridge this divide in some way? And I think digital platforms are definitely not going to do it. So there is a space for real public debate, strengthening the public sphere, and of educational institutions, not just universities, but at all levels of education.
Thanks, Shalini. And Nico, just a few words maybe on the role of corporations, if you figured that one out.
Yeah, kind of easy to say it in a few words. Of course, I think one has to kind of really paint a nuanced picture, and the state-private relationship is developing in very different ways in different contexts. In fact, the discussion that we've just been having now contributes to that, kind of the question of how much trust do people have into the elites running states, and how much can states deliver, and how much does the decreasing ability of states to deliver in a globalization context contribute to the loss of trust that then leads to greater erosion, really, of state power to govern, right? Which might be a vicious cycle. But what I wanted to point to before was largely kind of the very differential capacity of states to be able to deal with public goods issues going forward. And it's clear that the state, and as we have seen in the 2008 crisis, we've seen it around the world in many crises, the state is recognized as a crisis manager. It has to jump in as kind of an insurance mechanism. When things go badly, everybody looks to the state, and the state is meant to deal with it through the health system, through the social security system, through all kinds of means. Now, the problem is, of course, this overburdens the state at that point, and the state can't finance itself to take on that burden because it has lost lots of the revenue capacity that it had generated in the second half of the 20th century, largely because of tax erosion and kind of different ways of revenues flowing away from the state. So it is overburdened in those moments, and for the next decade, it has to shoulder the burden that it has taken on, and it will have much less ability to act on other issues. And that is a shift, I think, that we see in many places, which means the state has less ability to actually deliver goods. Other actors are out there who are trying to deliver or want to deliver or jump into the space that has been kind of opened up, and that we increasingly turn to for solutions, right? So we might not look kind of to the state to do something, but we want to choose the next app in order to get our public issues resolved, right? We might use platforms rather than the state. And the increasingly limited capacity of the state to kind of act, especially make the investments necessary for action, I think make us run the risk that we're increasingly in the hands of those able to provide those services. And I think your example of universities was a very good one for the platformization risk that we're running there.
Thank you, Nico. And I think we're just about out of time, so unfortunately I don't think we'll be able to take any of the questions online, but we'll take a look at them and maybe provide some answers afterwards at the alumni office. But I did want to come back. I mean, as all you guys know, I was really kind of desperate to end on some sort of positive note. So just rack your brains, and in a very, very brief, like 30 seconds or so, what are your thoughts on what could contribute, but really, really brief, what could contribute to a more positive outcome in terms of what we're living through right now? And it doesn't need to be the world, just one or just one thing or two things. Suri?
A silver lining, if I may,
Yes.
for me is that I think there will be much broader societal recognition of the importance of health as a value, and that we all will recognize more clearly that without health, we have nothing else. We don't have access to education, we don't have economic activity, we don't have social interaction, and so we have to be able to put in place the systems that will protect health for everyone. And I think this is a value that health has been undervalued for a very long time. Maybe this will change that.
Excellent, thanks. Marilor?
Yeah, actually, it's quite similar to what Suri said, but maybe in more general terms about, some a shift of values and value systems. All those things we had thought very valuable and very important turned out to be much less important than things that were undervalued in the previous world. And this, really applies, for example, to the types of jobs that, were rewarded in the world before and turned out to be much less useful in such a situation than the job of persons taking care of our garbage, taking care of the logistics of our supermarkets, etc., so that we could still go on and survive. So I think that this is creating an opportunity, this crisis, and again, a lot of the problems, we've said that, all of us, a lot of the problems were there before. The crisis has not, led to the problems. A lot of the problems were there before, but the crisis should really make us rethink the valuation system that is at the heart of our societies. And this is where we should contribute in a place like the Institute to help, bring that out in a much more scientific and expert kind of way.
Great. Nico?
Yeah, so difficult. But I think really, so probably if the crisis can serve for something, I think it's really as a wake-up call. I think in a similar way as if you said it before, sort of make us see what we value and what we might lose. And I'm thinking especially of the WHO. I think in that context, right? A few people had heard about it at the beginning of the crisis. Then they kind of started hearing about it. It seemed kind of strange, not really doing anything. But I think once the US turned against it, kind of people rallied around it and said, well, look, this is actually something important to keep, right? We need to stand up for it. And I think that's something that we all have a responsibility for, kind of making everybody aware of the things we can lose and engage in thinking kind of how can we rescue them, make them better, rethink them, kind of take them into a new 21st century world, really, kind of from the old world, but have a form through which we can govern ourselves together rather than have it everybody do for themselves and against each other.
Yeah, I mean, sort of like learning to stop blaming others for things. I think the British maybe learned that the hard way with Brexit after blaming the European Commission for so many things for so many years. Shalini, your 30 seconds.
Just final thought, just picking up a lot of what has been said before. So I think what the pandemic has shown is the really intimate connection between our individual bodily health and the health of the body politic, so that the well-being of every individual depends on the common good, just not thought in a national context, but thought in the global context. So I think and I don't know how to get there, but if we could somehow come out of this situation with greater solidarity, both within societies and between societies, recognizing that the virus cannot be defeated in one part of the society, one part of the region, one part of the globe, we really have to think of all our health, individually and societally together. I think if that solidarity is one of the results of the pandemic, then I think we would have learned a valuable lesson.
Thank you so much, Shalini. So, I mean, basically building back better and stronger is a possibility from all of this, and greater solidarity and a greater sense of personal responsibility in all of this. And actually, to go back to what Shalini said before, and I will take advantage of my position as moderator to say perhaps having more women in leadership might provide a different perspective on many of these things. So with that, I would love to thank this wonderful panel, both here and at home. And please don't tune out quite yet. We're going to thank the panel, and then we will move on to one very last part of this discussion. So thank you all very much. Let's give them a round of applause.
you. Maybe Nico. And Jennifer, thank you so much. Thank you to all of you. Donc, je vais maintenant demander à tous nos alumni qui sont en ligne d'ouvrir leur caméra. Donc, if you can please switch on your cameras. Nous allons vous faire apparaître derrière moi, gentiment. D'abord, on va avoir le bateau, déjà, que nous avons réservé pour l'année prochaine. Merci. Donc cet événement touche évidemment à sa fin. Merci tout particulier à l'ensemble de nos intervenants ce soir. Merci au pôle web mené par Luc D'Alessandro dans l'équipe communication d'Anne Graham, à Mélissa Iglesias-Vielat, responsable de l'événementiel, et à toute son équipe, en particulier Pascal Veltin et Alexis à la régie. Merci enfin à mon équipe, composée exclusivement d'étudiantes de l'Institut. Donc, Victoria Pitet, Zaninka Nagunjir, et puis les étudiants qui nous ont aidés également ce soir, Ting et Aynur. Si vous voulez venir sur scène, tous ces jeunes qui travaillent avec nous, merci beaucoup. Et puis, voilà, je profite encore d'avoir la parole pour vous inviter à jouer en ligne au quiz sur l'histoire de l'Institut, qui existe en français et en anglais. Vous êtes déjà plus de 300 à avoir joué à ce jeu. J'espère que vous aurez appris de belles choses sur notre alma mater, notre institution. Et puis enfin, vous dire combien nous espérons vous retrouver en chair et en os l'année prochaine à la réunion annuelle des alumni qui aura lieu donc le 11 septembre 2021, normalement à bord du mythique bateau Le Simplon, qui lui-même a fêté ses 100 ans ce week-end. Et d'ici là, je vous souhaite à tous et à toutes une excellente soirée, et puis surtout, prenez le plus grand soin de vous et des vôtres. Merci infiniment. Nathalie.
Merci Karim.
Merci à vous. Merci à vous.